not to be confused with the New York City DEP. My staff have come from Albany. We are managing the contamination aspects of this project out of the Albany office of DEC. Thank you. How many of you were not here at the last meeting? Show of hands. Okay, a handful. Most of you did come to the last meeting? Okay. For those of you who didn't come to the last one, I'm going to repeat a few of my remarks, and I apologize if you've heard these before. My agency, the DEC, does not get into the planning decisions that are made about this site. Our job is to manage the contamination that is beneath the surface of the existing mall and the parking lot. Okay? You're going to hear a presentation tonight about the specifics of what is there, how it got there, the history of the site. But my agency does not make any of the planning decisions, such as whether or not to build the tower that a lot of you are very concerned about. Okay? One of the questions that was raised at the last meeting was, where is the cleanup plan for the site? And I didn't get a chance to answer that at the last meeting, but the answer is, right now, there is no cleanup plan at the site. Okay? We have not been approached by the developer. We have not been approached.
Will you make an announcement for the people to keep quiet? Let's everybody keep quiet and hear what he has to say.
The people in front are hearing an echo, and it's difficult to hear because there's noise in the background. So,
move the mic.
Can you help us out here? The people in the front are having difficulty hearing. Is that better for you? Better for you? Okay. All right. And how about this? Is this better? This is better? Okay. So the answer is, there is no cleanup plan for the site. We have not been approached with a cleanup plan by National Grid, who is the responsible party for this. And we have not been approached by the developer with any specific plans about what they are going to build, where they are going to build it, how deep their foundations might be, so on and so forth. And these are all the information that we need to design a cleanup plan. What you're going to hear tonight are the results of the investigation of the contamination, but nothing about what is going to be done about the contamination. Okay? I said at the last meeting that there are several ways that we can manage this. The contamination can be safely managed in place, the way it is right now. It can be managed by excavation. If the mall is taken down, it can be managed by treatment with cement material, to solidify it and prevent it from migrating. And it can be managed by a combination of all of those things, leaving some in place, excavating some, and treating some. And until we know the details of what's going to happen with the building and with the new construction, we are not in a position to comment on any cleanup plan for the site. We are not even assuming that the new tower is going to be built. One of the options on the table is to manage the contamination in place. And that's something we do all across New York State. Okay? My unit in Albany is responsible for all of the manufactured gas plant sites across New York State. And there are about 250 of them. You'll see a map in the presentation tonight about where these all are. We have a lot of experience managing these things, either managing it in place or properly managing any excavations that occur. It is our job to prevent people from being exposed to this contamination, no matter what happens. We have a lot of experience doing it, and it's a job that we take very seriously. Okay? So in addition to the slides you'll see about the contamination and where it is, we're going to show you some examples of when construction occurs, the methods that we use to make sure that people don't get exposed to the waste. You're going to see pictures of tents right next to occupied structures, right next to buildings. You're going to see the methods that we use to control odors, to make sure that the trucks hauling the material away don't track contamination through the neighborhood. Okay? These are only examples. None of these are proposed for this site at this time. Okay, we simply do not have a cleanup plan in place. Okay? We have a consent order with National Grid, the responsible party, to investigate, for them to investigate and remediate the contamination at this site. They are the corporate successors to Keyspan, and before them, the Brooklyn Union Gas Company. And you'll hear a little bit about the history of when the plant operated and how eventually National Grid acquired all these companies along the way, and along with that, acquired the responsibility to clean up the contamination. Okay? So, I'm very pleased to have Gardner Cross, who's on my staff, with us tonight to make the presentation. Gardner is recognized nationally as one of the experts in manufactured gas plant investigations and remediations. There's not a better person for the job to supervise the investigation of this site. Before I turn it over to Gardner, did any of the electeds want to make a few remarks beforehand? Councilman Deutsch, are you going to defer to the end?
After your presentation.
After the presentation? Anybody, any other electeds? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Terry.
Actually, can you hear me in the back without the mic at all?
Okay, I'm going to use the mic. As George said, we're here to present tonight a description of the investigation that we've done on the site and the results of that investigation. First of all, let's start with a description of what an MGP, a manufactured gas plant, is. When you turn on your gas stove to cook dinner, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're opening a valve that leads into a network of pipes that leads back to a series of natural gas wells, most of them in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The pipe network that delivers that gas to Brooklyn is only about 50 years old. Prior to World War II, there was no interstate pipeline network in the United States, and that network developed slowly after World War II. Prior to that, if you wanted gas service for cooking and heating, you had to make it locally. And it was made at places called manufactured gas plants. This is one on Bay Shore on Long Island, one of the biggest sites we have. Considerably smaller one in Schenectady. There's a whole bunch of these. Virtually every town in New York State that had more than 5,000 or 10,000 people in it, as of 1900 or so, had at least one gas plant. The city of New York had dozens. The manufacturing process involved basically heating coal or petroleum up in a closed vessel, not burning it, but heating it. And heating it to the point where there were chemical reactions that took place in the coal or in the petroleum that produced a flammable gas. That flammable gas was then drawn away from the manufacturing process, run through a couple of purification steps, and stored in big expandable gas holders. These things are basically like large teacups that came up and out of the ground. As the gas cooled off from the manufacturing process, a black, oily liquid called coal tar would condense out of the gas and drop to the bottom of the gas holders and the various pipes that connected the different parts of the plant. That coal tar is the principal contaminant that we're worried about at sites like this, and it's something I've spent the last 20 years of my life investigating. Coal tar is a useful product. There's a whole bunch of pharmaceuticals that are made using coal tar, but the type of coal tar that was made in the days of gas manufacturing was generally not very valuable. It's a quote from a standard textbook in 1920, a few years after this plant closed. They talk about a constant accumulation of an emulsion, which is a fancy chemical term for two liquids that you can't get to separate properly. Imagine if you took Italian dressing, shook it up in a jar, and the oil and water did not separate. That would be an emulsion. The stuff is flammable. But as you can see, this woman's got a beaker of it, and the density of coal tar and the density of water are very close to one another. It's very difficult to get them separated. And consequently, an awful lot of this stuff wound up in the ground. Again, a lovely quote from the textbooks of the day. Basically, coal tar escaped from gas holders in pretty large quantities, and in places where the soil underneath the gas holder had a lot of sand in it. There's a lot of pore spaces down there, and the coal tar could migrate sometimes considerable distances away from where it was introduced. Now, one thing I have to emphasize, this movement through the subsurface takes place in slow motion, very slow motion, inches or feet per year. But the fact is, this plant was here for several decades, and the general pattern of tar migration that you see in red here is that it generally leaked out of the bottoms of the gas holders. It's a little bit heavier than water, so if it's in a nice still environment like underground, it does tend to slowly sink through the water until it hits some barrier that makes it impossible to go further, and then it either pools up or starts moving sideways. In this particular case, the tar has gone downward something like 70 or 80 feet at least. We haven't had an awful lot of lateral migration. I'll show you that on a map in a little bit. But the fact is, conceptually, that's what we're dealing with, this kind of Christmas tree-shaped blob of soil that's been contaminated with black, oily tar. You're not alone. Like I say, there were over 200 of these sites. I believe the latest count, we got 254 of them under consent order. We're still finding orphan sites in small towns, but we're pretty close to having them all identified. We've been working on this problem for about 20 years, and we have by far the most aggressive program of investigating and cleaning up these sites of any state in the Union. Now, the Dangman Park itself. Plant operated from sometime evidently in the very late 1880s until sometime around the middle to the end of World War I. It evidently went in the last few years as a period in which it was only used for peak periods. But that's basically the time range. That means the contamination, almost all of it's over 100 years old. It's been in the ground a long time. We have maps and historic records for the plant itself. We've got a pretty good set of sketch maps that were prepared by fire insurance companies. MGPs, as you might suspect, were big-time fire hazards because they stored huge amounts of flammable gas. They did occasionally explode. The fire insurance companies wanted to know where these plants were and where the major components of the plants were located. So we have pretty good sketch maps every 10, 20 years through the history of the plant. What we don't have in this particular one is photographs. National Grid hasn't been able to turn out any. I haven't been able to turn out any. If you know anybody, a local library or something like that turns up photos of the plant, please contact us because I'd like to see them. The plant was eventually demolished and sold because it was replaced with a much bigger plant about a half a mile away. The current mall that sits on top of the site was built in the 1960s, and following a lengthy period of inactivity, DEC and National Grid's corporate predecessor entered into a consent decree in 2007 that covers many MGPs throughout Long Island and the outer boroughs of New York, and this is covered as one of those sites. Remedial investigation here started in 2009, included several phases of field work that you may have noticed. Various times we had pieces of the parking lot, both in front and in back of the mall, blocked off so that we could drill soil borings and find out where the contamination was at depth. 88 soil samples, 44 groundwater samples. I won't bore you with the numbers, but it's a pretty thorough investigation. The banner conclusion, the takeaway message from that is that we did not find contamination at the ground surface. The contamination is in subsurface soils. The buildings and the pavement that sit on top of the site today prevent any contact. So under the current land use scenario, there's a strip mall there in the parking lot. We don't see any way that anybody here is going to be exposed to that material. The contamination does not appear to be moving. Remember, the stuff's fairly viscous. It's been in the ground 100 years. We think it has gone about as far as we know. If there were major disruptions, if somebody were to put in a very high capacity well, for instance, you might be able to make this stuff move through the subsurface. And there's always the possibility that some future utility worker will dig into it directly. And we've had that happen on several sites statewide, and that's our number one priority, is trying to prevent somebody from digging into one of these things without knowing about it. Future disturbances, such as high-capacity wells, could change the distribution of tar. But one thing I want to emphasize, I wasn't here at the last meeting, but my understanding was that there was some discussion as to whether recent hurricanes that have hit New York City will redistribute that tar. And the answer there is no. First of all, keep in mind the stuff's been in the ground for 100 years. It moves, but it moves very, very slowly. Short-term weather events aren't long-lasting enough to really disturb the subsurface very much. And as an added margin of safety on top of that, in the immediate aftermath of Sandy, we and National Grid visited all of the MGP sites that we have along the Brooklyn waterfront, just quite a few of them, and did not see any evidence at any of those sites that anything had changed due to the storm. Okay, emphasizing this is a faded out air photo of the Trump Mall, sits in here. If this is hard for you to see and you want to see it in detail, come on up. During the question and answer period, we have a much more legible version of this on a poster board. You can point fingers at it and look at the details. The takeaway message from this one, basically the green dots here are soil borings which encountered coal tar in the subsurface. And this slice here, you can't see it because the slide's too high, but this shows the borings that encountered coal tar within 15 feet of the ground surface. And you see very few. They're right next to one of these gas holders. And that's the only place where we found contamination, even in the top 15 feet. But remember, the shape of the tar blob in the subsurface frequently ends up looking like a Christmas tree. So the deeper it goes, the wider it goes. Okay, now let's take a look. Where did we find tar below 15 feet? Quite a few more. The red ones show the highest levels of contamination, yellows a little less, and greens, so here, and here, show no contamination described at all. So keep in mind, this is in the subsurface. This isn't something that's going to come get us under current conditions. And this, by the way, is a very common situation for MGPs in the New York City area. As you all know, vacant real estate doesn't stick around for too long in New York. People tend to build stuff on them. Most of the MGPs in New York City have been closed for at least 50 years, and most of them have already been redeveloped in one way or another. So this problem of having active business on top of a contaminated site is something we deal with all the time. Groundwater. Groundwater in the immediate proximity of the tar is heavily contaminated. But there's some good news here. Nobody's drinking that groundwater. The city of New York is on a very, very high quality public water supply system that gets its water from reservoirs up in the Catskills. I envy you your water supply on a well in upstate New York, and the tap water here tastes way better than anything I can find. Basically, the groundwater does move away from the mall in two different directions. What's happening here is the small amount of contamination that dissolves in the water gets eaten by soil bacteria as the groundwater moves away from the site. So what you're seeing here, this blob is kind of an equilibrium where the contaminants are dissolving away from and getting eaten as they move farther away from the site. Again, it's a really common situation to see. So what's under the mall? You'll notice we didn't have any soil borings in the mall because we couldn't get a drill rig into an active business. Well, fortunately, we've investigated a couple hundred of these sites now. We got a real good idea of what we're going to find in the subsurface. The most likely thing to find is the principal target will be the foundation of the original gas holders. There's at least 2 and possibly 3 underneath that wall, as we showed you on that map. Typically, what happened when the plant closed down is they demolished the plant buildings and pushed them into this big open hole. So when we dig into one of these gas holders, what we frequently find is a big pile of demolition debris and a mess in between the pieces of demolition debris. Sticky, black, gooey stuff that smells absolutely horrible. I failed to point out some of the physical characteristics of coal tar. In terms of chemical contaminants, benzene and things like that, it has about as much benzene in it as a premium gasoline from a gas station. In many ways, it behaves like a thicker version of used motor oil. But the real thing to take away is the fact that it really, really smells bad. It smells like mothballs mixed with something badly burned. If you've ever driven behind a car that's having a piston ring failure and that billowing smoke that comes out of a failing engine. So what do we see as we move away? These are not, by the way, pictures from Diamond Park. They just happen to be real pretty ones from other sites, but the same theme happens over and over again. What you find is that the tar has found more permeable pathways in the sand. Some of the sand is a little coarser grained than other parts, and the tar follows the path of least resistance. It spreads out as it moves down and away from the site. It's common as you get farther away to see, this is, by the way, this is what's called a split spoon sampler. It's a steel pipe that's been driven into the ground to collect a soil sample. So, and then split in half. So these beds you see here were originally horizontal. And what you see is this coarse grain unit is all chock full of tar, and the unit right next to it is got hardly any contamination in it at all. That's important to keep in mind. We're not dealing with this gigantic pool or reservoir of yucky black liquid. We're dealing with little stringers and layers and seams of ugly black liquid. The reason I point that out is that the intensity of contamination diminishes as you get deeper and farther away from the site. And that means as you get out toward the edge of it, when you're cleaning it up, if you choose to clean it up, you may not have to dig the whole thing out. There are other techniques out there that are available for taking marginally contaminated material like this and making it safe. Okay, site redevelopment is an obvious issue here. You're going to hear this over and over again. We do not control the decisions over redevelopment of the site. We have concluded at the end of our investigation that the contamination can be managed in place if need be. It appears to be stable. It doesn't appear to be hurting anybody, and it doesn't look like it's going to hurt anybody in the foreseeable future. However, if the site is redeveloped, we have a role to play, a very strong role to play in protecting the public, both the people doing the construction and you folks who live in the surrounding community. And what I'd like to do now in the next few slides is show you the kind of stuff we've been doing for the last 20 years when we actually do clean on the site. But again, I want to emphasize that George started out with no decision on how to do this or even if to do this. No such decision has been made. In many ways, it's not our call to make at all. The other thing I want to point out is that this is not tax money at work. This is National Grid is on the hook for paying for all of the cleanup work if cleanup takes place, and for paying for the community protection. And actually, under a cost recovery agreement, they will end up paying state costs as well. National Grid NYSDEC have done dozens of these cleanups all over New York State. National Grid owns 3 major gas utilities in New York: Niagara Mohawk upstate, which happens to be my utility, Long Island Lighting, and Brooklyn Union are all part of National Grid now. So they own something on the order of 100 MGP sites. They have a group of people that specialize in investigation and cleanup of MGPs, just as we do. Consequently, we're constantly dealing peer-to-peer with people who know what they're doing. They've hired consultants that specialize in this kind of work as well. And we've got a pretty good working relationship and a pretty successful working relationship. Okay, how do we control odors? The easiest way is to build a tent over the site. And when I say a tent, these things are big. This is a site in Bay Shore, New York. You may have read about it in the Newsday over the past decade or so. It was one of the bigger MGPs in the state. We took over 3,000 truckloads of contaminated soil out of that site and had essentially no major impacts, no accidents, no odor complaints. And the reason is because we did all the work under a tent. Okay, not just a tent, obviously the trucks have got to get in and out of the tent, right? So there's this big gaping hole in the tent. What do we do when that door has to open? I'll get to that in a minute. We've also done these in very, very close proximity. This is up in the Bronx, a site called Mount Vernon, where we put one of the tents up and conducted our excavation immediately adjacent to an apartment building. Again, with no complaints. How do you keep the smell from escaping the tent? You put big air blowers in there, sucking air in from the outside, forcing it through carbon filters, which remove the vapors, and blow it to the outside through smokestacks. It's a very, very common technique for doing large excavations of smelly stuff. These things work. We've had a lot of experience with them, and they've worked well. If you have to do some small excavations outside, if there's some area for some reason that you can't get to with the tent, because in this case, because you're in the middle of the street, there are odor control foams available. That's what this guy is holding here. He is spraying this stuff that comes out of a fire hose and looks like dessert topping. And it's very highly effective at cutting and isolating the contaminated soil from the atmosphere and preventing odors from escaping. It's a very, very commonly used technique. I think almost every MGP cleanup we work on statewide ends up using this stuff at some point. Some other tight places where we've worked. This is the 99th Street Hospital in Upper Manhattan. Any of you that are familiar with the construction of the 2nd Avenue subway extension, the long delayed completion of the East Side subway, there's a station being excavated immediately adjacent to this hospital. And I mean, as close as I am to row 5 in this auditorium. And it's heavily MGP contaminated. We did a successful excavation right up next to the building, right in the middle of the street. And no odor complaints there either. The other major potential source of odors is the trucks leaving the site. We take some fairly extreme measures to prevent that happening. The trucks that leave our sites actually go for a car wash. They're not only not allowed to track contaminated soil into the surrounding community, they're not allowed to track any soil into the surrounding community. We literally run them over a nice clean car wash, and if we can't put up a big one like this, we'll set it up on a gravel pad, and the gravel will help knock the mud off of the tires of the trucks. The trucks also go out with an odor control foam seal on top, and actually this picture is actually about 10 years old now. We now do not only that, but we also further control odors. We haven't had an odor complaint from a truck leaving the site in over a decade. Dust control is done the same way dust control is always done at sites, by spraying the ground surface with water to suppress the formation of dust. All of this is monitored at the site perimeter. I'll show you some pictures of kind of generic looking electronic hardware. That is the monitoring system. There'll be one on the upland side, 2 or 3 of them on the downwind side. On a site like this where you're next to the water, you may need more than that because, as you know, in this neighborhood, the winds are highly variable. Sometimes they come off the ocean, sometimes they don't. So we put these pretty sophisticated gas detection units there. And then we run up against one of the good news, bad news situations in MGP remediation, and that is the fact that coal tar sinks to high heaven. That's actually good news. What it means is that you can't get exposed to harmful levels of vapor from tar without knowing about it. And our approach to this has been to go for all the fancy bells and whistles, but to also have someone walk around the site perimeter and make sure that we're not grossing people out, to make sure that we're not giving off odors that are strong enough to be obnoxious, but not strong enough to register on our meters. Here's the slide that says what I just said, basically. The end result of all